Hi, my name is Alex and welcome to Magic Missile Minis. Today I'm going to be taking some Warhammer Fantasy Orcs and turning them into Warhammer 40k Orcs. I start by doing some basic assembly for the Age of Sigmar miniature I'm going to be using as the base for this mini, being careful to clean up any sprue tabs left over by just scraping off the extra plastic with my X-Acto blade. I use some plastic cement glue to assemble these pieces together that essentially melts the plastic a little bit so it creates a really firm connection between the two pieces. I thought it was really interesting the way that these pieces connected actually, because it's one of the newer kits. I just found it kind of interesting compared to the old kits that are just torsos and legs and you stick them together. This had all these kind of more complicated pieces for what I assumed would be a basic mini. In order to make it 40k, I wanted to take some of the 40k orc heads and put some of the Age of Sigmar masks over top of them. This head was a bit too big, but I really liked the little chimney that he had, so I chopped that off with my craft saw and then clean it up with my X-Acto blade to get rid of the kind of rough edge that the saw created so that I can attach this onto the head I was working on earlier. Because the head was a lot more metallic, it was slotted in really well, and I actually really like how this little head turned out. It feels like a perfect combination of the masks from the fantasy kit and the more sci-fi feel of 40k. Unfortunately, because the heads are more specific in this newer kit, the head kind of attached a little bit weird. After that, I go back to some more of the basic assembly for the miniature. I take some of the arms that are going to be holding this big blade and glue those in with more of the plastic cement glue that we had earlier to try to cover up any of the seams that are going to be left behind. This piece is going to be the main thing I'm going to convert to make sure this communicates as a Warhammer miniature. I'm going to be adding a bunch of different gun parts to turn this into a big old two-handed gun that this guy's carrying. To start off with, I'm going to have to chop off some of the edges of the blade here to make some room for the main gun head that I'm going to be using a combination of my craft saw and X-Acto blade to shape the blade the way I need it to, and then using more plastic cement glue to glue in place the end of the pistol that was from the Orc Commandos kit. In order to make this gun feel even more 40k, I'm going to add this little Adeptus Mechanicus piece. In order to do that, I take my craft saw and chop away a segment of the blade, and using my X-Acto blade, I make sure that that is the right shape so that I can add a little bit more of my plastic glue and slot in the Adeptus Mechanicus gun. After that, it was time to add some smaller details that would really help sell the kind of Warhammer look of this gun in particular. I had this little switch box from another Warhammer gun that I attached to the very top here that also was attached with this little plastic cable. So after cutting that down to size, I take more of the plastic glue and I stick that into place. These kinds of cables, I think, are one of the main things that can really help sell a miniature to make it look 40k. I also attach this little plating from another 40k kit to add some very recognizable orc technology onto the gun. And then, as a final detail, I add another little piece onto the handle to go over his fingers. Since I'm not actually going to add a trigger finger, it kind of implies that it's kind of hidden underneath there somehow. And with that, the gun is finished. As I was putting it onto the miniature, however, I realized that the little switch box we added was keeping it from attaching to the mini. So since the glue hadn't quite finished drying yet, I popped that off and just slide it down into the front of the gun so that it isn't in the way anymore, attaching that in with a little bit more of the glue. I was really lucky that the glue was at the space where it was so that the pieces hadn't fully set and I didn't have to redo everything. But with that, I was able to attach it onto the miniature and start working on some other details. I add a 40k orc bracer on top of his wrist to make sure that it reads not too fantasy and a little bit more 40k. And I also add a little pistol from a 40k kit that I had onto his back, as well as a little line of bullets onto his belt. These tiny little details really help seal the deal that this is a very 40k orc, no matter which angle you look at him from. After that, I take some green stuff to fill in the gaps around his neck, like I had mentioned doing earlier. And then I go back to the weapon because there were a couple spaces that were a little bit empty, and I decided I would need to add some cabling. So the way that I do that is simply by adding a little noodle of green stuff and placing that into the shape that I want it, and add little rivets into it with a rubber sculpting tool. You can get little tools that will add this texture onto thinner pieces of green stuff to create cabling, but I didn't have any, so this was the closest that I could get. In order to really sell it, I go back in with a needle over each of the little ribs and kind of make an indentation on the side of the cable as well. And then once I've gone around the entire cable with the needle, I go back with the rubber sculpting tool to clean it up a little bit and make sure that it all looks like one little round wire. I add a couple of extra wires and cables, one of which does not have the ribbing to add a little bit of variation. But I'm really happy with these cables and how they turned out, especially seeing as there's much better ways to do this, but for what I was able to do, I was really proud of it. After that, I attach it to a base, and these Kitbash is finished. I'm really excited to paint this miniature. I think it looks really, really sick and really reads as a 40k mini. But while we watch this turnaround, I wanted to give a shout out to my patrons. You can see them listed here. If you want to support me on Patreon, the links are in the description, and it's a really great way to support the channel if you like the content you're seeing. And I also wanted to plug my band. We're called The Kin, it's KYN, and this is what one of our new singles sound like.
All the kids are running away from home, never had a place for them to know who they are, how to live. Don't look like that, don't live like this.
So if you like that sound, check us out. Again, the links are in the description for all of that, and we'd really appreciate your support. Now, on with the paint job. In order to do the orc skin, I generally like to mix a little bit of brown in with the green as a base tone. This creates a really good backdrop for the green we add later and makes it feel a little bit less like a paint by numbers book by adding this little bit of brown, because it makes it feel a lot more like a green flesh tone rather than painting him green. The red of his blood would be creating a slight brown hue over the green, and so by making this base layer green, it implies that it's actually a flesh tone. Once I've covered all of the skin in a brown, I go in with the plain green to add a mid-tone highlight. This highlight isn't really going to change much over the entire miniature. It's not really based in any highlight, so I just go over an even coating, mixing that in with some of the brown that is underneath it to have a little bit of a gradient, but generally speaking, it's going to cover most of the brown that we've added, since the brown is only going to act as the darkest point on this miniature, and this green should be the most prevalent color of his skin. Once I've gone over this miniature with this base highlight of green, I'm going to mix actually a little bit of yellow into that green to create the next layer of highlights. Adding the yellow makes the green feel a lot more vibrant and alive than if you're just going to be adding white. White not only makes a color lighter, but it also desaturates a color, basically meaning that the pigment of the green is going to get less and less intense as it gets more and more white. So adding yellow keeps the color very vibrant and makes it look a lot more alive than mixing it in with a white color would. This highlight, I'm specifically trying to focus a little bit more on the highlights and the directional lighting than the layer underneath it. Here you can see I'm also using wet blending to blend in and create the gradients rather than like glazing or something like that. I find that I just prefer this way of highlighting because you have a lot more control of how intense your gradient is. Once I've gone over the entire miniature and that highlight, I also go and add one more highlight on top of this that is very directional, and even more of the yellow is added into the color. I had a lot of fun painting the skin for orcs. I always have a lot of fun painting orc skin. It's one of my favorite things to paint. Orcs always have really defined musculature, which makes for some really interesting shapes and just really satisfying space for gradients and things like that. So I just love painting orc skin, and I'm really happy that for this project I had the time to actually spend some time and really make it look really good. Here, this lat highlight is the most directional. When you're painting a miniature, you should really remember that under harsh lighting that you use for actually painting miniatures so you can see what you're doing, it's always going to seem brighter than it actually is when you have it on a table. So you always want to make your highlights even brighter than you think you need to, so that when they're away from the harsh light, all of your shading and highlighting is still visible. Once I had finished all of the skin tone, it was time to move on to the rest of the mini. The next part that I paint is all of the metallics. So I go over the entirety of his mask with a basic metallic, as well as going over his gun. I found that while I was painting the metal, actually just doing a slightly heavy dry brush over the black was a really good way to bring out the different texture of all the different metallic parts. So I ended up doing a heavy dry brush over the whole mini rather than doing a really intense base coat and try to make a really solid base coat for any of the metallics. The first thing I decided to paint after the metallics was the armor was going to have some metal plating as well that was going to be painted yellow. So to create a shadow color, I just add some flat brown to create an undercolor that'll just help the yellow paint stick on better, as well as act as a bit of a shadow color. I kind of tried to do a dry brush over this as well, but it didn't quite turn out as well as the rest of the armor did with the metallic paint, so I ended up mixing a little bit of the brown into the yellow. And honestly, I could have stand to do this even more than I did to create really good transition and variation in the yellow armor. The armor plating for this miniature had some really good texture, and it looked very hammered, that I thought was really cool, and so I kind of wanted to try to preserve some of that in the paint job. The paint I ended up using was a little bit watered down as well, so I had to create several layers, which let me create interesting highlighting despite the dry brushing not quite working. I was very proud of myself. This is the first miniature I painted in a while that didn't have purple in the color scheme in any capacity. I really liked the yellow color of the armor plating for these orcs, especially because the next thing I wanted to do was add a little bit of a checkerboard texture onto certain pieces of the armor plating. I start by just painting a solid layer of white over certain pieces of the armor, and then I add little dots of black to indicate where I'm going to be putting the black squares. I'm not sure if this is necessarily the best way to start doing a checkerboard pattern, but it's the way that I did it, and it seemed to work out pretty well. I use these dots as essentially just a little map so that I know where I need to start painting, and I don't have to worry about filling in the bulk of the squares that I'm painting black over top of this. I also definitely need to get better paintbrushes. These came with the little wet palette that I bought, and they are not very high quality, so I might have to buy some new brushes, but I was able to get something that I liked pretty well, just being really careful about which parts of the brush I was using to actually paint with, to get the sharp lines that I needed for all of the squares that I'm painting. I come back in later with a little bit of white to start fixing some of the parts of the cross-hatching that didn't quite go so well. The squares aren't perfect, but I think it looks really good and it still works for what I was going for. After that, I decided a tertiary color for this pattern was going to be a light blue. So I add a little bit of that blue over the lightning bolt that's on the gun part here, as well as a little bit into the kind of glass vial light piece that's at the very end of the gun. And I thought it would also make sense to add that for the eyes that are inside the mask. I go in with a little bit of metallic paints to also cover all of the bolts of the miniature. And then I start working on the mask. I wanted the mask to be like a skull of some sort, so I start by adding a little bit of beige over top of it, and then apparently decide to move on to paint something else. I go back over to the gun with a little bit of black to cover some of the paneling and just add a little bit of interest over the gun itself, just to make sure that the details that are on the miniature stand out from one another. To further accentuate those details, I also mix a copper paint to cover up select parts of the guns as well. This is the normal recipe for guns and technology that I use for almost all of my miniatures. I find adding a copper really helps differentiate and add interest into blocks of technology on miniatures. After that, I take a little bit of beige and start doing some edge highlighting over all of the yellow metal plating. And once I've gone over the entire mini, I decided, I guess it was time to go back to finish the mask that I was painting. In order to get into the cracks, I add some watered down brown paint and then cover that back up with some more of the beige. Since my washes that I have are being weird, I decided to not use that and just go with some watered down paint instead. I then go over the eyes and add a slightly darker blue dot into the middle of the light blue I added to make it look a little bit more like glass. I also add an extra little dot of white to further emphasize the fact that they look like these glass visors underneath the mask. After that, I do a similar process on the little glass vial that's towards the end of the gun. After that, it was time to paint the leather. I mix a little bit of black with some flat brown and use that as a base shadow tone for the entirety of the pants and all the other leather parts of the miniature. I then mix a little bit of white into the brown to create a bit of a highlight. I don't worry too much about blending this in because these pieces of the miniature are so small, but it just helps accentuate some of the folds and details of the leather pants and other parts of the miniature. I then, to finish off the leather, take a little bit of beige and start doing an edge highlight over all of the leather parts. Once I add the basic edge highlight, I come in again with a little bit more of a rougher hand to just add a little bit more battle damage over the leather. Leather is one of my favorite things to paint, as well as orc skin. I think it looks really satisfying, and it's actually really simple to do because you don't need a too careful of hand to make some really cool worn looking leather by simply adding this little beige highlight onto the entirety of the leather. Once that was finished, I go over the miniature with a little bit more beige to cover up all of the material, like the loincloth, as well as all of the wrapping around his wrists, as well as the handle of his gun. I used the same beige color to paint his nails, and then after that, all that was left to do was add a little bit of texture paint onto the base, and this miniature was finished. I'm really happy with how this project turned out. I think that the Warhammer Fantasy armor that kind of peeks through all the technology that I added to make it very 40K adds a really interesting feel to the miniature. It makes me want to make an army that is a fantasy-inspired 40K army. One of the newer orc armies that you can make is the kind of dinosaur primal, but I like the idea of doing a more medieval 40K themed orc army. Overall, I really like how this miniature turned out. I really like how the gun turned out. I think it's really cool, and I'm excited to make more of these miniatures. I'm probably going to make this a series and finish these other two miniatures, making them 40K, because I've got some ideas for how I want to do them already. But thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to comment, like the video, do all the algorithm stuff, subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. If you want to support me financially, you can check out the Patreon, as well as checking out my band. All the links for those things are going to be in the description. But anyways, thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you guys... But anyways, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.